Good morning. As Charlie said, I'm a member here, not a minister. So please be kind. And do feel free to pick up any theological inaccuracies with Charlie after the service. We continue our series on the book of Matthew. I think the plan is that as we carry on going, we should get to Jesus' death and resurrection at Easter time. And today we're looking at the parable of the 5 wise and the 5 foolish young women. And thank you, Jane, for reading so well. As a commuter, one of my least favourite noises is when I've rushed for a train, only to hear the rapid beeps of the doors close as I arrive. Occasionally, I've managed to hop onto the train before it's left, in which case that noise carries with it a sense of smugness. But mostly, it's a sense of frustration as you watch a stationary train sit there that you can't get on and then watch it sail off into the distance. It can be very frustrating. I once got so annoyed at missing a train very early in the morning to go to the airport that I tried to take my frustration out on my luggage. I tried to give it a little kick in frustration. I missed. I sort of spun on the spot, landed on my backside, and tore a rather embarrassing hole in my jeans. I made the flight, but I missed a morning's sea kayaking because I had to wait for the shops to open so I could buy a new pair of jeans. When I was a student, I also once stuck my arm in the door, like in a lift, to see if that might open the train doors. It didn't. I managed to retrieve my arm, but very sadly watched a half-eaten Mars bar stuck in the door, sailing off to Leeds whilst I stayed behind. So I can certainly sympathise with the foolish young women when the door was shut and they weren't let in. Thankfully, this is not a passage about being punctual. I'm particularly pleased that's not a prerequisite to be a Christian. But there will come a time when Jesus returns or calls me home, and at that time I do sincerely hope that I'm able to reflect on a life lived for God. Although my accent says otherwise, I come from Northern Ireland, and I've been to a few family funeral services in Northern Ireland over the years. And in my experience, personally, without exception, the minister tends to take the opportunity to ask the congregation whether they have let Jesus into their lives. It's quite a visceral image, forcing you to sort of think about hell whilst you're looking at a coffin. And I'm sure it's sincerely meant. I personally find it a bit jarring when people are there to see a funeral service of remembrance for a life lived for God. But you may be pleased to hear that's not what I plan to focus the message on this morning. But I will take the opportunity to share a favourite Northern Irish fire and brimstone story, if you'll bear with me. Dr. Ian Paisley was apparently once preaching on, I assume, the previous chapter, Matthew 24, which talks about weeping, wailing, and gnashing of teeth. And apparently an elderly member of the congregation put their hand up and said, "Mr. Paisley, I don't have any teeth." And Dr. Paisley leant on the lectern and looked directly at her and said, "Teeth will be provided." Which I think is comedy genius. Brilliant. In the previous chapter, Jesus talked about the signs of the ends of the age and the implications for those who don't keep awake when the Master returns. I'm very grateful to Charlie that we have skipped sermons on chapter 24 because there's quite a lot of theologically complex content. But before Jesus gives this parable, and in his explanation of the parable, Jesus talks of us not knowing the day or the hour that he will return, and tells us to keep awake, therefore, for you know neither the day nor the hour. As some of you are aware, I very sadly lost my father recently in November after a fairly short battle with cancer. Whilst he did not know the time or the hour that Jesus would come, he knew better than most throughout 2024 that the time that he would meet Jesus was coming pretty soon. That made 2024 a very hard year for us as a family, as I'm sure you'd expect. And my dad told me several times that he found it to be the year in which his faith was challenged the most and his relationship with God was the hardest. But I know that in the last few weeks, as his body was starting to give in, he was very proud to be able to reflect back on a life in which he had not swerved to the left or the right and had run with perseverance the race that was set before him. His was a lifelong walk with God in which he had asked God to help and shape his decisions and provide him with the strength to face whatever each week would throw at him. And I will never forget the raised fist in worship in the last few hours on his last day as we played worship music together as a family. Now, to be clear, this is not a parable about death. Nor does this passage talk about death. Jesus is talking about the time when Jesus will come again. But I don't think the parable is just talking about that one moment when we will meet Jesus again. I think Jesus is calling us to consider our daily walk with God. In calling us to keep awake, I think Jesus is asking us to do the day-to-day well, so that we can live in his kingdom and bring his kingdom to those around us in our everyday life. And by doing so, in that moment when Jesus does come again, we'll be ready for his return and able to reflect back on a life lived for God. There's an aside in one of Ricky Gervais's comedy shows in which Warwick Davis talks about following the teaching of the church down the road, where he can basically live his life doing whatever he wants and then just say sorry at the end. It's a cynical put down, scripted by Ricky Gervais, but unfortunately I do think it touches on the sort of last-minute, narrow escape view that some people have of the Christian faith if they don't engage with God. That is clearly not the way that Jesus is calling us to live our lives. Jesus tells us in chapter 4 that even he doesn't know the day or the hour that he will return. In 1988, some of you may know this, there was an American minister who believed that Jesus was going to return between the 11th and 13th of September 1988. He published this booklet, which I think 200,000 copies were produced and distributed around the States, and some people did believe this date to be the end date. Some people quit their jobs, took their kids out of school, and headed across various states in the US to be together as a family for this last day on the 11th to 13th of September 1988. He was wrong. Jesus didn't come. Spoiler. But the behavior is perhaps similar to what you might expect if we did know the hour and the day that Jesus was to come again. Last weekend, I watched the film A Complete Unknown, which I can highly recommend. It's about Bob Dylan's rise to fame in the 1960s. And there's a short scene in the middle of the movie where lots of people around America are glued to black and white TV screens whilst a president delivers the news that the US and the world could be on the brink of nuclear war. It's very tense, and it sort of builds the context that the folk music scene had at the time of possible nuclear war. The next scene, after people are glued to TVs, is on the streets where there's some degree of chaos in New York City as people pack their bags and 20-somethings who live in tiny apartments in the city jump into cars to go and be with their family. Jesus' call here is not that we might know the day and the hour and close the doors and be with our families and stay in silence ready for him coming. Rather, he calls us to follow the example of the 5 wise young women who simply brought their flasks of oil with them alongside their lamp. I expect the same 5 young women would have brought their oil in their jar on any other day because they were always ready to turn up with the lamp and with the oil that would keep the lamp burning. When I showed this slide to Antonia last night, she immediately said, "That looks familiar." Whenever we head somewhere for an overnight stay as a family, there's often a tense moment when we've packed the car and we're all finally inside ready to set off. We're probably already running late. And we realize we don't have enough fuel to get to our destination. So we get to the top of the road and we can't turn right to go onto the motorway. We have to turn left to go to the supermarket to fill up with petrol because we simply can't get there without fuel. If we want to be able to shine the light of God's kingdom on a daily basis, we have to come to God to fill us up. We need God's Spirit, God's kingdom, His wisdom, guidance, His word, His prompting in our lives if we are to extend and show God's kingdom to those around us. The 5 wise young women made sure they'd filled their oil jar so their lamp could continue to burn. I spoke a little while ago, towards the beginning of the series in Matthew, about being the light of the world, and shared this image of Thomas Heatherwick's Olympic flame from the 2012 Olympic Games, which I think is stunning. I'd shared it to show that when the church comes together, we burn brightly, but one of the wonderful features of this torch is that it would fold out and display individual lights. So I think we are individually our own flame as we go out the door in the morning and go about our day-to-day lives in work, at the school gates, with family, with friends. And in the same way that the young women's oil lamp needed plenty of oil to produce light, and the Olympic flame needed fuel to continue to burn, so I think we too need God's Spirit, God's kingdom, God's word, God's strength in us if we are to bring the light of God's kingdom to those around us. We cannot rely on our own reserves, but must seek God's kingdom in us if we're to be effective representatives of God in our daily lives. We sang this morning, "Morning by morning, new mercies I seek." A little bit like once you've filled the car, you've driven it, you've got to fill it again. And I think we need this fuel of time spent with God, the oil of God's kingdom, for ourselves, so that we have the knowledge and wisdom of Jesus' teaching to make good decisions. I know that was something my dad placed super highly on his priorities. And also so that we can turn to God for the strength to live day by day. We need God's kingdom to bring God's love and God's insight to others as we walk alongside family or friends who are going through a tough time. To have the prompting to pray for them, to pick up the phone or write to someone in need. Something which Rob has encouraged in me, to send a message to a friend who's going through treatment on the day of treatment, to wish them all the best, to show them that you're thinking of them. To visit in hospital, to check up on the person who's struggling or the person who's lonely, and to help to lighten their burden, practically however you can. And following on from Andy's tips that he closed with in last week's sermon, so that we can have the reserves that come from God's strength to enable us to show compassion to those at home and at work, even when we're tired, so that we can have the patience to listen, so that we can have the encouragement to say the positive thing to someone, and not the negative thing or turning straight to gossip. And we need the oil of God's kingdom to live out the values that are written around the church. And I think it should all be a bit of a virtuous circle. By spending time in prayer and in God's word, in worship and in fellowship, seeking God's strength, his peace, his guidance, we ask God to fill our oil jar daily. Not knowing the hour or the day, but keeping awake, so that when opportunities present themselves for us to share God's kingdom, we can do so. We've got the fuel to be able to keep that light burning. And as we see God strengthening us and moving in our lives and the lives of others through us, we learn to lean on him more. And so it continues day by day, week by week, year by year. And so that when the time comes that he returns or calls me home, we'll be ready. And when that time comes, we'll be able to look back on a life where we have run with perseverance the race set out before us, without swerving to the right or the left. As we sang this morning, we'll be able to reflect that all my life you have been faithful. All my life you have been so, so good. As we've taken our flasks of oil daily. So I'd encourage you this week to be like the wise young women in the parable. To ask God each day to fill the oil in your jars. Thank you.